the 7th of December, 1943, F6. When Japanese Zero pilots first spotted the chunky, unremarkable F6F Hellcat rolling off American carriers, they burst into laughter at what they called another fat American turkey. Within 18 months, that same turkey had slaughtered over 5,000 Japanese aircraft, while losing only 270 of their own, 1D, a kill ratio so devastating it single-handedly crushed Japan's air superiority forever. But how did American engineers turn what looked like flying scrap metal into the most lethal fighter plane in Pacific history? The 7th of December, 1941. Japanese Zero fighters screamed across Pearl Harbor's burning waters like silver arrows from hell. Their wings cut through black smoke as American ships exploded below. The Mitsubishi A6 Zero was the perfect killing machine. It could climb faster than an eagle and turn tighter than a sparrow. American pilots called it the Zeke, but they whispered the name with fear. The Zero ruled the Pacific sky for 2 long years. Its empty weight was only 3,700 pounds, making it incredibly light and quick. American F4F Wildcat fighters were fat and slow compared to these Japanese devils. The Zero could reach 331 miles per hour and climb to 32,000 feet. Most deadly of all, it could turn in a circle that seemed impossible. American pilots who tried to dogfight a Zero usually died. Japanese pilot training was brutal and perfect. Young men spent years learning to fly like samurai warriors. They believed their emperor was a god. They thought Americans were soft and weak. The Zero proved them right again and again. At Wake Island, Zeros shot down American planes like clay pigeons. In the Philippines, they destroyed entire squadrons on the ground. Over Java and Burma, American pilots fled when they saw the rising sun painted on Zero wings. Captain Saburo Sakai was Japan's greatest Zero ace. He had shot down over 60 American planes. His hands were steady as stone, his eyes sharp as a hawk. He once said that flying the Zero was like wearing silk gloves that could kill. Other Japanese pilots nodded and smiled. They owned the sky from Tokyo to Australia. American factories worked day and night to build better fighters. The F4F Wildcat was tough, but too slow. The P-38 Lightning was fast, but hard to fly. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft drew new plans on their drafting tables. They needed something to beat the Zero. But what? Japanese pilots laughed when they heard about new American fighters coming. They had beaten everything America could build. In early 1943, a strange new American fighter began rolling off assembly lines. It looked fat and heavy next to the graceful Zero. Its wings were thick and wide. Its belly bulged with fuel tanks and armor. Japanese spies took photos and sent them to Tokyo. Intelligence officers studied the pictures and shook their heads. This new plane looked slow and clumsy. They called it another American turkey. The first F6F Hellcats reached Pacific carriers in late summer 1943. Japanese pilots watched them taxi across carrier decks through their binoculars. The Hellcats looked like flying trucks next to their beautiful Zeros. Veteran pilots like Sakai saw the thick wings and heavy body. They laughed and placed bets on how many Hellcats they would shoot down in their first battle. None of them suspected that this ugly American fighter would soon turn their perfect war into a nightmare. The 31st of August, 1943. The first blood came over Marcus Island when 12 Hellcats met 16 Zeros in morning sunlight. Japanese pilots dove from above, expecting easy kills, like always. Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare led the Hellcats in a tight formation. The Zeros came screaming down at 400 miles per hour, their 20mm cannons ready to tear apart another group of fat American fighters. But something went wrong. The Hellcats did not break formation and run. Instead, they climbed straight up at the diving Zeros. The Japanese pilots blinked in surprise. No American fighter had ever climbed so fast. The Hellcats' Pratt & Whitney engines roared with 2,000 horsepower each. They pulled their heavy bodies skyward like rockets. Within seconds, the hunters became the hunted. 6.50 caliber machine guns erupted from each Hellcat's wings. The sound was like thunder mixed with steel rain. Japanese pilots had never faced such firepower. Zero fighters carried only two 20mm cannons and two light machine guns. The Hellcats spat out 2,400 rounds per minute of armor-piercing bullets. Zero after zero exploded in orange fireballs or spiraled into the ocean trailing black smoke. In 10 minutes, 8 Zeros were destroyed. Only one Hellcat was damaged. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai watched in horror from his cockpit. His perfect Zero suddenly felt like a paper airplane. The Hellcat that chased him weighed 12,500 pounds fully loaded, almost twice as much as his Zero, but it was faster in a straight line and much stronger. Sakai's bullets bounced off the American fighter's armor like pebbles. The Hellcat's bullets tore through his Zero's thin skin like it was made of rice paper. October 1943 brought the Tarawa raids. 30 Zeros rose to meet 18 Hellcats over the Coral Island. The Japanese expected another turkey shoot. They got a massacre instead. The Hellcats flew in perfect formation, their pilots talking to each other through radio sets. Japanese pilots had no radios in their Zeros. They fought alone, like samurai of old. The Americans fought as a team, like a pack of wolves. The battle lasted 20 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 28 Zeros lay burning in the lagoon or scattered across the coral beaches. Only one Hellcat was lost. Japanese ground crews stared at the empty sky in disbelief. Their invincible Zero fighters had been swept from the heavens like leaves in a typhoon. By November, smart Japanese pilots were learning new rules. Never dogfight a Hellcat. Never climb against a Hellcat. Never try to outrun a Hellcat in a dive. The old tactics that worked against Wildcats meant death against these new American fighters. Young Zero pilots still tried the old ways and died quickly. Veterans like Sakai began to understand a terrible truth. The Americans had built something better than the Zero, much better. The 19th of June, 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot began at dawn when Japanese radar operators spotted the largest air armada in history approaching their islands. Admiral Ozawa had launched 430 aircraft from his carriers, confident his pilots would destroy the American fleet. He called it Operation A-Go and promised the Emperor a great victory. Instead, he delivered the death of Japanese naval aviation. Wave after wave of Zeros, Judies, and Kates flew toward the American task force. They expected to find the usual small groups of defending fighters. Instead, they met a steel wall of 450 Hellcats rising from 15 aircraft carriers. The sky turned into a slaughterhouse painted in aviation fuel and blood. Commander David McCampbell led Fighting Squadron 15 into the storm of enemy planes. His Hellcat's 6 machine guns spoke with deadly authority as he lined up shot after shot. Japanese pilots who had dominated Pacific skies for 3 years suddenly found themselves helpless children fighting grown men. McCampbell shot down 9 enemy aircraft in one mission, his guns so hot they glowed red in their wing mounts. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai watched his squadron die around him like cherry blossoms in a hurricane. The Americans had numbers, but that was not what killed his men. The Hellcats were simply better fighters, flown by better pilots. American training had improved while Japanese training had collapsed. New Zero pilots had only 100 hours of flight time. American Hellcat pilots had 600 hours before they reached combat. The difference showed in every dogfight. Radio transmissions crackled with desperate Japanese voices. Enemy fighters everywhere. Cannot escape. My Zero is burning. American pilots heard the panic and pressed their attacks harder. The Hellcats dove, climbed, and rolled through enemy formations like wolves among sheep. Japanese aircraft fell from the sky in burning pieces. Some pilots bailed out and watched their precious Zeros explode below them. Others rode their planes down into the blue Pacific depths. By sunset, the numbers told a story of complete disaster. The Japanese had lost 426 aircraft and 445 irreplaceable pilots. The Americans lost only 29 planes. The kill ratio was not 5 to 1 or 10 to 1. It was almost 15 to 1 in favor of the Hellcat. Admiral Ozawa stared at the reports and felt his world collapse. Japan's naval air power had been destroyed in a single day. That night, surviving Japanese pilots sat in their ready rooms and spoke in whispers. The Zero was no longer the king of Pacific skies. The Hellcat had taken its crown and crushed it underfoot. Captain Sakai wrote in his diary, "Today I learned that courage without superior weapons is just another way to die. The samurai code meant nothing against American steel and firepower." The war was lost, even if Japan did not know it yet. The Hellcat had taught them the hardest lesson of all. Pride comes before the fall. The 15th of August, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, announcing surrender. The war was over, and the Hellcat's final tally was written in blood and steel across Pacific skies. In 3 years of combat, F6F's pilots had destroyed 5,163 enemy aircraft, while losing only 270 of their own. The kill ratio stood at 19 to 1, a number so devastating it rewrote the rules of air warfare forever. Captain Saburo Sakai sat in his bombed-out hangar near Tokyo, staring at the twisted remains of his last Zero. American B-29 seconds had burned most of Japan's cities to ash. The proud samurai who once laughed at fat American fighters now understood the terrible price of underestimating an enemy. He had survived when so many of his friends had died, but survival felt like punishment rather than blessing. In American factories, the last Hellcats rolled off assembly lines as workers celebrated victory. Grumman had built 12,275 F6F fighters, more than any other naval aircraft in history. Each one had been a flying fortress, packed with armor, firepower, and American industrial might. The joke was on anyone who called them fat and slow. They had proven that in war, substance mattered more than style. Japanese aviation engineers studied captured Hellcats with bitter respect. The American fighter weighed twice as much as a Zero, but flew faster and hit harder. Its secret was not just better engineering, but better everything. Better pilots with more training, better tactics with teamwork instead of individual glory, better radios, better guns, better armor, and most importantly, better strategy from a nation that understood industrial war. Former Zero pilots who survived the war became farmers, teachers, and factory workers in occupied Japan. They rarely spoke of their flying days, but when they did, they always mentioned the Hellcat with quiet respect. American occupation forces found Japanese flight manuals that warned pilots to avoid fighting Hellcats whenever possible. The fighter that began as a laughingstock had become the most feared weapon in Pacific skies. The psychological impact on Japanese morale was even more crushing than the physical losses. Veteran pilots who had once owned the sky now refused to fly combat missions. Young replacement pilots lasted only days before being shot down by prowling Hellcats. By 1945, Japan was so desperate for aircraft that they began using suicide attacks because conventional air combat had become hopeless against American air superiority. In 1965, 20 years after the war ended, Saburo Sakai visited the United States and met some of the American pilots who had fought against him. They sat together in a California restaurant, old warriors sharing stories and sake. Sakai raised his glass and said, "We thought our Zero was perfect, but perfection is not about being light or graceful. It is about winning." He paused and looked at his former enemies with tired eyes. "Your Hellcat taught us that lesson, one dead pilot at a time." The meeting revealed deeper truths about the war's outcome. American pilots spoke of massive training programs that produced skilled flyers by the thousands. Japanese pilots learned that America had built 300,000 aircraft during the war, while Japan managed only 76,000. The numbers told the story of two different worlds, one that could replace losses and improve constantly, another that grew weaker with each battle. Years later, aviation historians would study the Hellcat phenomenon and discover the deeper truth. Japan's early victories with the Zero had created dangerous overconfidence that blinded them to American potential. They saw early American fighters like the Buffalo and Wildcat struggle against their nimble Zero and assumed all American aircraft would be inferior. This fatal mistake cost them the war in the air, and ultimately, the war itself. The Hellcat's success story became a lesson taught in military academies around the world. Never underestimate your enemy's ability to learn, adapt, and improve. The Americans had taken their early defeats and turned them into motivation. Every Zero victory in 1941 and 1942 had taught American engineers exactly what they needed to build. The result was a fighter that looked ugly, but fought like a demon. In the end, the most important number was not the 19-to-1 kill ratio or the 5,163 enemy aircraft destroyed. The most important number was 0, the number of major Japanese air victories after the Hellcat entered service. The chunky American fighter had not just won battles. It had ended Japan's dream of controlling Pacific skies forever. Those who had laughed loudest at the beginning learned that in war, as in life, it is not how you start that matters. It is how you finish.